I now give the floor to Mr. Chay Bows.
Well, thank you for asking me to appear, ladies and gentlemen and chairman. And despite well over a year of frenzied and what is now recognized as loosely regulated supply of incalculable numbers of weapons to Ukraine, sources within the country still maintain that it needs an escalating volume of heavy and light weapons and ammunition to conduct its operations. And it's now glaringly apparent that what began as NATO supporting a Ukrainian military that it had built since the beginning of the civil war in the East in 2014 has now in real terms become a proxy conflict where Ukraine supplies manpower with ever-diminishing operational capability to support a de facto NATO operation to prevent a Russian military victory in Ukraine, and thus avert the potentially terminal impact such a victory would have on the operational, political, and reputational survival of NATO itself. It's critical that the reality of this situation is seen for what it actually is. This is indeed the very real escalating concern of NATO planners and their political funders, particularly in the ever hawkish Anglosphere. And this geostrategic reality also, of course, drives the seemingly perpetual escalation of military aid to Ukraine. All of this is despite tens of billions of dollars of weapons in various states of operability already being delivered to a country which the US State Department has described as endemically corrupt and in many sectors of society essentially lawless. And this was as recent as 2019. And it's crucially important that we are clear as to the kind of country these vast amounts of weapons are being delivered into. And I'd like to quote directly from their report in 2019 entitled Country Reports on Human Rights Practices, Department of State, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labour. And this is a shocking report that maintains that unlawful and arbitrary killings and torture are widespread, as are the abuse of detainees by law enforcement personnel, harsh and life-threatening conditions in prisons and detention centres, arbitrary arrest and detention, substantial problems with the independence of the judiciary, restrictions on freedom of expression, the press, the internet, including violence against journalists, censorship, the blocking of websites, the control of the press is widespread. It goes on to cite serious concerns regarding government corruption and crimes involving violence or the threat of violence targeting persons with disabilities, ethnic minorities, which I presume includes the Russian-speaking minority in the east of the country, and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex community. And it's into this cauldron that the Western powers are pouring incalculable volumes of weapons and munitions and money. On the front lines, meanwhile, the military progress for the now serially depleted Ukrainian military is undeniably strategically insignificant, particularly in the context of the long-vaunted and publicized counteroffensive, where all qualified and objective, independent and non-aligned analysts must agree Ukraine is failing to achieve even the necessary initial breakthroughs against well-prepared and well-resourced Russian lines of defense. It's very interesting to hear the paid expert contributors in Western media encouraging an almost perverse, stiff upper lip, look the other way attitude when faced with the undeniably brutal losses Ukraine has and has undeniably suffered. These young men dying in their thousands are, in my considered view, the most foremost victims of this perpetual escalation in military aid to Ukraine, as they attempt to advance in close order, in daylight, across minefields, into pre-zeroed artillery kill zones, often in 30-year-old second-rate NATO-supplied armoured personnel carriers, like the US M113, a lightly armoured steel box, first entering service in 1960 and a veteran of another US foreign policy disaster, the Vietnam War. These may be accompanied by a handful of German Leopard tanks, many of which are decades old and grossly unsuited to the Ukrainian steppe, or maybe by what are supposed to be mine-resistant vehicles, all of which have been shown now to be exceptionally vulnerable to Russian anti-tank warfare systems, attack helicopters, and the brutal reality of in-depth Russian minefields. All of this occurs with no meaningful air support, let alone air supremacy, which Russia commands with its in-depth air defense systems and a large fleet of modern multi-role fighters. The idea that these assaults, which are essentially amounting to suicidal full frontal attacks on in-depth prepared defenses, are allowed to continue is, in my view, deeply cynical, and I would suggest sinister. No modern NATO military strategist or senior officer would suggest these maneuvers are anything but an inhumane ticket to tragedy when commanding their own troops. Yet, when it comes to these Ukrainian young men mounting these assaults, being decimated, they are silent. They accept the Ukrainian government's ban on reporting from the front lines on the vast losses in men and material that evoke scenes more familiar with the Somme or Passchendaele. As increasingly depleted Ukraine can indeed defeat Russia on the battlefield, this ideology is a delusion. In eastern and southern Ukraine, somehow reclaim Crimea and subsume an unwilling ethnic Russian population back into a chaotic and essentially failed state governed from Kiev. The quality of some of the equipment which the United States has urged its smaller NATO allies to donate to Ukraine is at best repairable and at worst outright lethal, not to the Russian defenders, but to the Ukrainian operators. Several of these incentive deals have been done to entice NATO countries to dump older vehicles into a desperate Ukraine on the promise of replacement with better or at least younger equipment. In one case, Germany replaced 40 BMP-1A1s, one of the oldest versions of this Soviet troop carrier, for the Greek army with 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles through a Ringtausch program. The Soviet-era armour then being forwarded to Ukraine. The same type of deals have been widespread regarding the hasty requirement to feed Ukraine's Soviet-era artillery, such as the Grad MLRS system, with post-Soviet states in Eastern Europe offering hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery and rockets to the country in return for replacement systems. Surely the morality of this is deeply questionable. Of course, there is one fiscal beneficiary, and that is, of course, the NATO military-industrial complex, of which the United States is by far the biggest player globally. A recent New York Times article has outlined how profiteering and incompetence has further complicated the chaotic landscape in Ukraine when it comes to the flood of heavy and light weapons into the country. According to it, and I quote, Ukraine has paid contractors hundreds of millions of dollars for weapons that have not been delivered. And in some of the much publicized arms donated by its allies have been so decrepit that they were deemed fit only to be cannibalized for spare parts or indeed scrapped. The Ukrainian government has revealed documents that show, as at the end of last year, Kiev had paid arms suppliers more than $800 million for contracts that went completely or partly unfulfilled. Two of the individuals involved in the purchasing of this equipment, according to the New York Times, said that as of early this spring, hundreds of millions of dollars had been paid, including to state-owned companies, for arms that never materialized. And according to Volodymyr Havrilov, a deputy defense minister, and I quote, "We did have cases where we paid money and we didn't receive any of the weapons." And I would like to point out again, some of these contracts are with state companies, according to the New York Times. And it's very important that we try to show the sheer scale and volume of weapons flooding into Ukraine since last year. The United States alone has committed well over $40 billion worth of military aid to the Kiev government. The EU and other states have also contributed tens of billions into what we know to be one of the least regulated states on earth when it comes to control of corruption and institutional accountability. In addition, Ukraine has spent billions of dollars of its own money on the private arms market, possibly the most difficult area to ascertain any kind of transparency in. It's worth recalling that over the 20-year period of the US intervention in Afghanistan, the US Department of Defense paid various companies about $108 billion in contracts for work performed in the country, with 1/3 of those contracts spending remarkably going to undisclosed recipients, domestic and foreign businesses who are not uniquely identified in the publicly available contracting databases. This information is from a landmark piece of work done by the Watson Institute for International Affairs, Brown University in Rhode Island in the USA, in their cost of war research on the Afghan misadventure. These vast sums would suggest to the novice taxpayer that Ukraine is receiving high-tech supplies, but in a reflection of the poor quality of Western donations and the brutal battlefield attrition rate, as much as 30% of Kiev's arsenal is under repair at any given time. And that's according to a source reported again by the New York Times in a separate article. It also suggests that a recent delivery of 33 self-propelled howitzers donated by the Italian government were basically only good for scrap, and that the Italian Defense Ministry had stated that the vehicles had been decommissioned several years ago, many years ago, but the Ukraine had asked for them anyway to be overhauled and put into operation, given the urgent need for a means to face Russian aggression. In a Pentagon Inspector General's report released last May, also illustrates some of these serious issues. An American unit was supposed to ship 29 Humvees, a very small amount of equipment to Ukraine from a depot in Kuwait. The cost of this action bears no remote link to any sort of strategic imperative whatsoever. By the time it actually arrived in Poland, only 3 of the vehicles were actually battle-worthy. The tires were rotten on them all, and they had to be replaced at huge cost and basically choking up the whole supply chain. The same thing has happened with M777 howitzers, which were a much vaunted game changer in the long line of much vaunted game changers that were going to turn the tide of the war in Ukraine, according to the Western media. Instead, the M777 howitzer has become a sitting duck for Russian loitering munitions, and we have verifiable evidence that over 100 of these units have been destroyed in the field in Ukraine. And by the way, the Pentagon report also says that at least one of the M777 howitzers was in such a bad shape it would have killed the operators trying to use it. And that is in the inspector's report that was concluded in March 2022. Similarly, Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace announcing the planned transfer of AS-90 howitzers in Ukraine to great fanfare. We stand with Ukraine. In fact, when we look into this transfer, we see that these howitzers were unserviceable in varying states of readiness, and they ended up being scrapped or used for spare parts. So the haphazard distribution now of small arms across the country is probably more disturbing, if not more so, in the context of the Ukrainian conflict. Long before the Russian military operation in Ukraine began last February, various reports were highlighting the dangers to civil society of the widespread distribution of small arms and ammunition across the country. Now, Max Blumenthal has referred to some of this. In February 2022, Ukrainian authorities remarkably began to distribute tens of thousands of assault weapons, rifles, grenades, and millions of rounds of ammunition to the general population. In one incident alone, 6 kilometers from the center of Kiev, thousands of weapons were distributed to anybody willing to carry them. Some 18,000 portable assault weapons, rifles, and pistols with ammunition were handed out to untrained civilians within days of the Russian intervention. This was confirmed by Ukraine's Interior Ministry advisor, Vadim Denisko, to the BBC. It's impossible to imagine or even speculate as to the volume of illicit and official small arms now circulating in the country. A country, again, experiencing catastrophic levels of dysfunction and destruction, criminality and corruption. I don't need to cite the various Interpol reports. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu suggesting that there are Western anti-tank weapons now on the borders of Israel in the hands of the enemies of Israel. I won't quote those because they're widely and they've been mentioned by other briefers. But this leads to my next point, which I'm anxious to make regarding the potential destructive power of every single military-grade weapon in the wrong hands. The unthinkable destruction of a single anti-aircraft weapon could have on the periphery of any European airport. We've all seen the tragic consequences of the brutal terror attacks at the Bataclan Theatre in Paris in November 2015, where 130 innocent civilians died and 416 were injured. The attackers carried Zastava M70 assault rifles, which had been previously deactivated and reactivated for the attacks. The M70 is a Serbian copy of the Kalashnikov rifle, the most common weapon now circulating in the tens of hundreds of thousands in Ukraine. It's a lethal and capable weapon, easy to use, easy to conceal, and in the wrong hands, capable of delivering catastrophic destruction and firepower. Unfortunately, given the huge scale of the saturation of Ukrainian society with such weapons, it's absolutely inevitable that significant numbers of these weapons have and will continue to be sold on the black market to the highest bidders, particularly in a society racked by conflict, societal breakdown, and the ensuing lawlessness that brings. It doesn't take vast numbers of weapons to cause significant civil strife and lead to severe local and potentially national escalation of conflict. In my own country, British forces colluded with loyalist paramilitary gangs through the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s to terrorize and murder hundreds of innocent civilians over decades with relatively minuscule amounts of weaponry, actually less than hundreds of firearms. The Irish Republican Army was able to mount a serious threat to the British state itself with relatively small amounts of weapons and explosives. Thousands were killed and injured during a decades-long conflict sustained by a relatively small arsenal of weaponry. When the IRA decommissioned its arsenal, it was found to have only 1,000 rifles, 2 tons of Semtex explosive, and 7 surface-to-air missiles. Yet this was enough to mount a sustained and significant threat to the British state. As I've mentioned many times, more weapons were handed out over a period of days to civilians in Kiev in the context of the Ukrainian conflict than these numbers themselves. They're absolutely minuscule, but they demonstrate the potential for a relatively small armed group on either side to exert disproportionate influence in any post-conflict period, which could lead to the collapse of any accommodation or agreement. It is the proliferation of these weapons that potentially could lead to decades of instability, not only in other parts of Europe and further afield, but in Ukraine itself. Finally, and to wind up, I recently spent some time in the city of Belgorod, which has come under sustained attack from Ukrainian artillery and drones. I visited the town of Shebekino and a large displaced person centres the government is providing to tens of thousands of ordinary civilians that had to flee their homes due to the indiscriminate shelling of civilian targets. I stood with an 83-year-old woman as she asked me what she had done to deserve a high explosive drone to target her home in a civilian terror block in Voronezh, a Ukrainian drone. I've seen those villages burning. I've heard the artillery strike, and I have to tell you that weapons being supplied by NATO and their allies to Ukraine are being willfully targeted against civilian populations on a daily basis in Donbass, Lugansk, Belgorod, all miraculously invisible to the Western media. It's incumbent on all here that have any influence to convey the reality of the conflict to their own people, to avoid the increasingly dangerous spiral of escalation that leads us further towards the absolutes at the expense of compromise. I owe it to the men and women and children who I've met in the conflict zones, who I have had the privilege to speak to convey the reality of increased militarization in the region. I urge you to seek accommodation and peace, to respect the democratic mandate of those who have expressed it. Settlement will come, and it's my absolute belief that it's up to those in Washington and London, now fueling the conflict with endless escalatory military aid to Ukraine, to decide where and when that settlement occurs, either at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. We have an expression in Ireland: he who pays the piper calls the tune. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Bose for his briefing.